So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second public informational meeting of the Martha's Vineyard Beach Road Study. My name is Patrick Snyder, and I'm the MassDOT project manager for this effort. I'm joined today by our consultant team. I would like to thank all of you for joining us, including any elected officials or members of their staff in attendance this evening. Thank you for coming. Welcome. We're meeting tonight to discuss this conceptual planning study for Five Corners and Beach Road. This is an important intersection for connectivity in Tisbury and on Martha's Vineyard. We appreciate your patience throughout the study process as we've worked to determine future year flood models and develop alternatives. Before we get started with the meeting content, we'd like to review some Zoom procedures so that we're all on the same page. We will have the opportunity for discussion, questions, and comments later in the presentation. If you'd like to share comments or questions during the presentation, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little button at the bottom that says Q&A. You can click on that and type in your question or comment. You can also use the buttons on the bottom left to edit your audio and video options. You will have the opportunity to speak verbally later at tonight's meeting. At that time, you can click the raise hand button or click Alt-Y on a keyboard. If you're on the phone, you can dial *9 on the keypad, which will raise your virtual hand, and we will see it on the screen and recognize you. If you're unable to access the internet tonight or have technical problems, you can call into the meeting on the phone at 1-312-626-6799, enter the webinar ID 892-6769 or 663, and enter the passcode 516871. These numbers are also in the confirmation email sent by Zoom when you registered for that meeting, so you can refer to that. If you're watching this meeting on a computer, you can use the view button at the top right hand of your screen to adjust your view settings. Closed captioning is available. It's automatically generated by Zoom and can be activated with the button at the bottom of your screen. CC closed captioning, that's the button at the bottom. If you have trouble with the meeting technology during the presentation, please call 1-888-799-9666, which will dial Zoom technical support. Before we launch into the presentation, I would like to open with a few procedures for today's meeting. Please note that this is an open virtual public meeting and is being recorded. Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat transcripts. So by continuing with attendance with this virtual public meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. If you're not comfortable being recorded tonight, you can stay on mute or choose to excuse yourself from this meeting. The slides and recording from today's meeting will be posted online on the website at a later date. During tonight's meeting, we welcome all questions and comments. Again, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We do ask that you keep them all respectful. In terms of tonight's agenda, we'd like to provide an overview of this study, why we're carrying it out, and what the goals are. We'll continue with an initial review of flood vulnerability and the safety analysis, which we carried out as part of our foundational work for the study. We'll then review our draft alternatives and present our analysis of potential impacts. Then we'll give an overview of recommended next steps, and there will be a public comment period for any questions, comments, or feedback. Proceeding to an overview of this study. These are the goals and objectives we established at the beginning of this process. We aim to evaluate roadway improvements at Five Corners and Beach Road to increase safety and comfort for all road users, including vehicles, pedestrians, and bicyclists. This will build on a road safety audit that was carried out and previous discussions about addressing operations at this intersection. We also aim to address current and potential future flooding. MassDOT recognizes this is a key challenge at this intersection, and we want to collaborate with local stakeholders to address flood vulnerability and on decision-making here. This map shows the extent of the boundaries of our study area, which extends along Beach Road to the Tisbury Town line, down a portion of Lagoon Pond Road, and it is also bounded by the Beach Street Municipal Parking Lot, Main Street, and the Steamship Authority Ferry Terminal. And we'd now like to review our initial flood vulnerability assessment. The existing drainage system at Five Corners is key to any flood mitigation work done at this location. There are outfall pipes in the study area at Beach Street Extension, Lagoon Pond, Main Street, and Beach Road. These pipes form part of the stormwater management system by facilitating drainage off of streets and properties. MassDOT and the town of Tisbury have identified challenges with the existing drainage system that make it difficult to manage stormwater. The low elevation, effectively at the current sea level, makes it vulnerable to storm surge. Flooding regularly occurs at Five Corners due to backup at the Beach Street Extension outfall pipe, as well as drainage that slopes down to Five Corners rather than to coastal outfall points. The Beach Street Extension outfall pipe also gets blocked up during storm events, which contributes to backflow and further exacerbates the flooding issues. MassDOT has proposed drainage improvements under Highway Division's project number 609459 to help mitigate stormwater at Five Corners. As you'll see on the following slides, stormwater challenges are exacerbated by future year flood vulnerability. We will also note on this slide that the town of Tisbury and other stakeholders have proposed additional flood mitigation measures here. We are happy to continue dialogue about that as there are multiple jurisdictions in this area. Part of this study involved looking at future year flood models to understand projected sea level rise and how it may affect the study area. In planning for flood mitigation at Five Corners, it's important to consider how any potential projects could mitigate future flooding, as well as the current stormwater issues. The figure on the screen here displays sea level rise projections from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA for short. Displayed sea level rise scenarios project anywhere between 1 and 6 feet. Five Corners is the lowest point in the study area at 2.5 feet above current sea level. Stormwater flooding on top of this sea level would exacerbate water levels, as we will see in coming slides. We'll also go over this more during our alternatives analysis review later in the presentation. The figure on this slide shows coastal flood exceedance probabilities originating from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. Coastal flood exceedance probability is the likelihood of flooding at a specific location occurring in any given year. The main horizon year we focused on in this study is 2030, and I will elaborate on that later in the presentation during the alternatives analysis. This data comes from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, CCM, which is the lead policy planning and technical assistance agency on coastal and ocean issues for the Commonwealth. Any future projects to address flooding in this area would likely require coordination with CCM. Coastal flood exceedance probabilities shown here are between 0.1% and 100%. Most of the study area in the gray here is projected for that 100% gray flood exceedance in the year 2030, which means more significant flooding at Five Corners than already occurs. This indicates that during a storm event, most of the study area will be flooded beyond the area that already floods today. As part of the study, we carried out flood modeling in order to review potential horizon years to plan and develop concepts. Per direction, we used the Resilient Mass Action Team model, which is a risk screening tool developed as part of the state's resilience planning initiative called Resilient Mass. RMAT is a preliminary risk screening tool that outputs results based on categories assigned to assets, such as their critical operation during emergency events. Assets, in this case, being transportation infrastructure, buildings, natural resources, to name a few. Inputs to the RMAT tool resulted in targeted planning horizons of 2030, 2050, and 2070. Mean high water level, MHHW, it's a measure that indicates the highest level water can reach. For these years, 2030, 2050, 2070, was a minimum of 3.7 feet for sea level rise in 2050 as output by RMAT. This would be during the highest high tides during the year. When it comes to sea level rise and storm surge, RMAT recommended a target planning horizon of 2070 with an intermediate planning year of 2050. Based on the criticality of Five Corners in the Martha's Vineyard transportation network, The output was to plan for a 1,000-year storm return period, probability of a storm occurring in a 1,000-year return period on the stormwater flooding side of things. Projections for baseline sea level rise, let alone 1,000-year storms in 2050 and 2070, are significant enough that it's challenging to plan for flooding in these years within this study's scope of work. For 2050 and 2070, the mean high water projections are significantly higher than the existing 2.5 feet elevation above sea level at the Five Corners intersection, where Five Corners now is about 2.5 feet above sea level. The projections are that daily, the highest tides can be anticipated to rise above the area's current elevation in 2050, which would carry impacts for transportation, drainage, and local properties. When we think about the 1,000-year storm in 2050, which is what the RMAT output indicates we should plan for, that's approximately 14 feet of flooding with wave action and storm surge, all things considered. Solutions to address flooding of that magnitude are outside the scope of work of this study. After deliberation with study team members, we determined to use a 2030 horizon year for purposes of study analysis to carry out this process, which will inform future work. We will provide more detail on that later as part of the alternatives analysis slides. At this point, I'd like to pass it to Joe Zisman from our consultant team at Cambridge Systematics to give an overview of our safety analysis, which help inform subsequent alternatives analysis for roadway improvements.
Thank you, Patrick. We analyzed crash data from the period between 2018 and 2022 for the study area. One fatal crash occurred in the study area during this period, a nighttime head-on collision of two vehicles on Beach Road near the Lagoon Pond Bridge. Two injury-causing crashes have occurred at Five Corners, one involving a pedestrian and the other involving a bicyclist. The study area as a whole saw 18 additional injury-causing crashes. The three clear crash clusters occurred in downtown Vineyard Haven between 2018 and 2022. The first was at Five Corners in the Lagoon Pond Road leg, the second on Water Street northbound at the access point to the ferry terminal, and the third on Beach Street where it intersects the Cromwell Lane alleyway and the municipal parking lot. Five Corners is designated as a top crash location, and a road safety audit was carried out at this location, which was one of the reasons this study was carried out. The study area sees a large volume of pedestrian traffic. It's a village center and a business hub for those who visit Martha's Vineyard, live there, and work there. It has a ferry terminal with service to Woods Hole, the island's primary post office, a full-service grocery store, and the Black Dog Tavern, in addition to many other small businesses, as well as a small number of residences. Sidewalks and curb ramps are not always sufficient for pedestrians. Some are narrow or are obstructed with poles. Brick sidewalks can be uneven for those with mobility challenges. Crosswalks and the ramps leading to them are not perpendicular to the road and are not clearly marked for accessibility. No pedestrian flashers or other pedestrian signals exist. Street lighting in the area generally is poor. Some of the turns are also too tight for large trucks and buses accessing Water Street, and we observe these vehicles mounting the sidewalk in some cases, a dangerous situation for pedestrians. The study area sees a large volume of bicycle traffic. Not only is this driven by destinations in the area, but also by the strong commitment that Martha's Vineyard communities have made to building a robust bicycle network. A gap in that network exists in the study area. There is a missing link in the island-wide shared use path network between Oak Bluffs and Edgartown through the Five Corners area. On the basis of all of this analysis, this study discusses high-level conceptual design alternatives for the study area. The alternatives have two components that mirror the two components of the analysis. The first of these, safety and road treatments, focus on improving multimodal operations and safety. They primarily consist of changes to roadway geometry, signage, and control. The second is adapting to and mitigating the impacts of near-term flooding. While the study analyzed and considered long-term flooding, as Patrick mentioned, more significant analysis will be required as part of any project development. The conceptual design alternatives are presented as short-term, medium, and long-term. They are also at two locations, Five Corners and also at the intersection of Main Street and Beach Street. We will present the alternatives for Five Corners first. The short-term alternative for Five Corners includes rebuilding sidewalks to be ADA compliant, including curbing and curb ramps with tactile strips, realigning crosswalks to be perpendicular with the street, repainting all sidewalks to improve visibility, installing indicator signs for crosswalks, potentially with rapid flashing beacons, repainting stop lines on Lagoon Pond Road, Water Street, and Beach Street Extension, painting new Shark's Teeth yield lines on approaches without stop signs, and painting a curving yellow line to connect the center lines of Beach Street and Beach Road. These are designed to be relatively low-cost improvements that can be implemented relatively quickly. The medium-term alternative for Five Corners includes the low-cost quick-build measures from the short-term one, but makes two substantial changes to roadway geometry. First, Water Street is narrowed from 3 lanes to 2. This allows for the construction of a shared-use path for pedestrians and bicyclists. Second, Beach Street Extension is raised and turned into a shared street for cars, pedestrians, and bikes. That is also known by the Dutch term Woonerf. The street would have pavers instead of an asphalt surface and would be accessed via a ramp-like sloping sidewalk from the level of the intersection. This has several benefits. It creates a clear physical through line from Beach Street to Beach Road and simplifies the apparent complexity of the intersection from 5 legs to 4. The raised surface also potentially allows for stormwater storage underneath Beach Street Extension and resloping of the outfall at the end of the street to improve drainage. Access to Beach Street Extension would be maintained for all adjacent homes and businesses under this proposal, and it would also still potentially be available for parking. The space could be allocated in a number of different ways during the project. It would just appear less like a typical street and more like a driveway. 2 long-term alternatives were developed for Five Corners: a stop-controlled intersection and a roundabout. The stop-controlled option differs from the prior alternatives by making more substantial changes to roadway geometry and alignment. Specifically, Lagoon Pond Road is curved so that the intersection becomes more perpendicular, resolving the current tight turning radius that brings trucks onto the sidewalk. This alternative also includes a shared-use path along the south side of Beach Street and Beach Road, accomplished by narrowing Beach Street to 2 formal lanes. This alternative may require additional right-of-way, which would be evaluated as project development proceeds. The roundabout option at this location has been discussed in the past and would require substantial additional footprint beyond the current extent of Five Corners. This is one possible location where a roundabout could be centered, but it could move all around the potential outline of the intersection. Note that the width of the Beach Road approach at the roundabout prevents the inclusion of a shared-use path under this scheme. A single set of improvements was developed for the intersection of Main Street at Beach Street, consisting of quick-build improvements to sidewalks, ramps, crosswalks, and roadway markings. A long-term enhancement, which is not drawn, could extend the shared-use path from the long-term Five Corners alternatives through this intersection on the south side of Beach Street and State Road. Patrick will take you through the alternatives analysis, which includes a discussion of infrastructure elevation. Five Corners sits at approximately 2.5 feet above mean sea level in 1988, also referred to as NAVD 88 or NAVD 88. This study considered raising the intersection in the long term to either 5 feet above NAVD 88, which is 2.5 feet above current ground level, or 5 feet above the current ground level, which is 7.5 feet above NAVD 88.
Thank you, Joe. So we'd now like to review our alternatives analysis, which is an outline of anticipated roadway impacts and potential flood mitigation measures. In terms of anticipated impacts related to roadway elements, we've split those up amongst the short-term, midterm, and long-term alternatives. When it comes to the short-term alternatives, these are anticipated to result in safety and operations improvements for pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as vehicles. They would upgrade the intersection to current MassDOT standards and create new ADA-compliant pedestrian infrastructure. Short-term alternatives would likely be insufficient to address the current turning radius challenges for large vehicles, such as buses and large trucks. The short-term alternatives are conceptualized within existing right-of-way footprints. I'll note on this and the next slide that potential right-of-way impacts are fully evaluated later in the project development process. The midterm alternative for the Five Corners intersection is anticipated to have the same impacts I listed for short-term. The midterm alternative builds off the short-term alternative with some additional improvements, a shared-use path along Water Street, and a potential raised shared street at the Beach Street intersection. The short and midterm alternatives would likely have temporary construction impacts if they advance to project development. These could be access changes or noise related to construction activities. These impacts would be assessed at a more detailed level during project development, and presented as part of any design public hearing. Looking at the impacts of the long-term alternatives, they would both formalize the intersection, which is anticipated to have safety benefits. Delineating clear travel path priority would clarify road user right-of-way. The pedestrian improvements would also be expected to enhance safety for vulnerable road users. When it comes to the roundabout option, the number of conflict points for vehicles traveling through the intersection would be reduced. So there are also safety improvements anticipated with that alternative. Long-term changes at this location could also address the current turning radius challenges for large vehicles that have been mentioned. The long-term alternatives could also increase bicycle connectivity by contributing to the island-wide bicycle route, with the potential for extended shared use paths on Beach Street and Beach Road, alongside a potential connecting shared use path on Water Street. The full intersection, alternative 1 here, would be designed so as to accommodate the turning radii of large vehicles. This would facilitate travel for large trucks and buses. The roundabout, which we have listed as alternative 2 here, would also be designed to accommodate large turning radii. It would likely have right-of-way impacts, as the current intersection footprint is somewhat constrained for a roundabout of standard size. For this study, we assumed a roundabout of 105-foot radius, which would be conceptualized as centered on the northwest corner of the Five Corners intersection. The ultimate footprint and associated right-of-way impacts would be assessed in future project development stages. We also discussed roadway elevation associated with long-term alternatives in order to address current and future flooding. Depending on the height that the road were elevated to, this would likely have extended right-of-way impacts beyond what we've already conceptualized here. We will go into that more on coming slides. As I mentioned on the last slide, there would likely be temporary impacts associated with construction activities such as noise, access, anything else related to construction. We've developed high-level summary cost estimates with unit costs based on 2024, 2025 dollars and based on historical MassDOT cost data. For purposes of estimation, the short-term improvements are assumed to be implemented in 2025 and the midterm in 2027. Long-term alternatives did not assume a construction year, as they are contingent on potentially incorporating flood mitigation measures. However, they do include contingency costs. These are all estimates and would be subject to change during any potential project development. Going through the list, we have the short-term improvements estimated at $322,000, with the additional potential improvements at Main Street, the short-term ones being $201,000. Midterm improvements at Five Corners, we estimated at $2.3 million. Long-term roundabout would be base level $3.8 million, and the long-term formal intersection at Five Corners would be between 1.8 million and 3.1 million, with the range based at base level changes to the Five Corners intersection, and the larger end of that cost, including a potential Woonarf at Beach Street Extension, that shared street concept that we discussed as part of the midterm improvements. We discussed a variety of flood mitigation measures for this study. This included a stormwater retention tank under Beach Street Extension or another location, as well as potentially elevating these roadways. A stormwater retention tank in this area could provide storage capacity for flood waters during storm events. However, a location for this would need to be determined based on stakeholder consensus, necessary storage capacity within the tank, and likely a hydraulic analysis. If Five Corners or Beach Street Extension were elevated, a retention tank could be placed under the intersection itself. Along this would likely be the need for a pump system, which would need to be maintained. That being said, because of the anticipated volumes of floodwaters, a stormwater tank might be insufficient and likely would not protect the study area from wave action along the harbor line coming in from the coast. Hydraulic analysis of these effects is outside this study scope of work. Along with the impacts of flooding itself, with any associated construction here, there would be those temporary impacts we discussed, noise, access, There would also likely be right-of-way impacts to abutting properties if any infrastructure here were elevated and raised. The elevation levels that we considered during the study, based on internal discussion and suggestions from the Town of Tisbury and Alternatives Analysis Report, which looked at flood mitigation options, were 5 feet and 7.5 feet above that NAVD 88 measure, the standard benchmark for sea levels. Stormwater flooding in 2030 is projected to be above these levels at about 7.8 feet near the shoreline in a 20-year return period, and at about 11 feet in the 1,000-year recurrence planning horizon. Return periods, which I referred to earlier, are benchmarks that indicate how severe flooding will be in a given year based on the occurrence scenario. A 20-year return period indicates the probability that a storm of certain severity would occur every 20 years. Looking at a 1,000-year return period, these flood depths are anticipated to be even more severe, with RMAP projecting at least 11.5 feet. Considering all of this, the roads in this study area would likely need to get elevated above 7.5 feet above NAVD 88, the level of which would need to be determined during project development. Naturally, this would likely have significant impacts. Thinking about the 2030 horizon year that we evaluated, with the time that it would take to design, engineer, and implement a project, the flood mitigation measures we developed in this study could become obsolete soon after completion. So, looking at these impacts, we do see a significant amount of flooding projected for 2030. When we think about the project development timeline, the time it would take to initiate, design, engineer, and construct a project, that likely approaches 2030. So any implemented alternatives that are outlined in the study could quickly become obsolete and likely would not be sufficient to protect from flooding. With the projections for 2050 and 2070 being more severe, these flood mitigation measures likely would not address flooding beyond 2030 either. The figure on the right here shows several 2030 flood scenarios, including average tide levels, high tide levels, sea level rise in 2030 under a 20-year storm, and 2030 sea level rise under a 100-year storm. As you can see in the figure, both the 20-year storm and the 100-year storm cover a very significant portion of the study area. Under the 20-year storm event, we're looking at projections for a minimum of 7.6 feet on the shoreline per that RMAP model we used. Here we have a side view visual of the various 2030 scenarios. There are 3 base level elevation points of reference here: Main Street at 23 feet above sea level, Five Corners at 2.5 feet, and Beach Road Causeway between Vineyard Haven and Oak Bluffs at 12 feet. These are static points of reference, the current land heights. These are not water levels. When it comes to flooding in 2030, we've split up the 20-year and 100-year storm events here. All measurements are relative to NAVD 88, that standard sea level measurement. The initial flood reference point here is the 2024 average mean sea level at the bottom on the screen. It's about half a foot above NAVD 88. Above that, we have 2030 average tide elevation projected for 1 and 1.2 feet, the average between high and low tide. The 2030 high tide elevation is projected for 2.4 feet. These are base levels without flooding from storms. Looking at stormwater, which further increases the water elevation and causes more significant waves, building on that flooding. For the 20-year storm event in 2030, this could be between 7.7 feet at the base level, with waves potentially causing up to 8.8 feet of flooding. When we look at the 100-year storm event in 2030, the anticipated flood heights are higher, with a 9.3 base level and 10.4 feet, including waves. These numbers are even higher under the 2050 and 2070 year scenarios. In line with what we referenced before, with elevating infrastructure 5 feet or 7.5 feet to project from stormwater flooding, all these scenarios exceed those levels. So we've reached a point of discussion about how high roads could get raised if they were to be raised. This requires more detailed analysis that would need to come during project development after we conclude the study process. We would want to collaborate with local stakeholders, such as the town of Tisbury, Steamship Authority, and other property owners before advancing road elevation as part of any potential project. So all of that said, we'd like to discuss our proposed next steps and recommendations based on the results of this study. This study is being carried out by MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning, and discussing the results with our counterparts in the Highway Division. The recommendation was to advance project number 609459, which would alter part of the drainage system at Five Corners to address current flooding. Work under this project would address challenges with the existing drainage system, including pipe slopes and the backflow at Beach Street Extension that worsens current flooding at Five Corners. More significant flood mitigation measures would need to be discussed with area stakeholders, which we are prepared to do. Thinking back on the flood projection scenarios, 2030, 2050, 2070, for this study, we evaluated 2030 as our horizon year for flooding. The typical project development process includes design, engineering, and construction. With the time that these steps would take, any potential project at this location would run up around the 2030 horizon year. Thinking about how significant stormwater projections are in 2030, let alone 2050 and 2070, we would need to collaborate as a larger group since the affected area extends beyond MassDOT jurisdictions. As MassDOT considers advancing a road project in this area, flood mitigation measures could be incorporated, but we do want to achieve consensus with what those are with local stakeholders. At a minimum, any future potential project advanced in this area should include additional drainage enhancements to improve the existing drainage system. If the road were to be elevated, we would need to come to a decision collectively with you as stakeholders about a height that would address future flooding, but also minimize impacts to the community. A significant portion of the study area lies outside the jurisdiction of MassDOT. We're responsible for the state-owned roads and the drainage underneath them, but other elements are outside our jurisdiction. To fully protect this area from flooding, we'll need to collaborate amongst all stakeholders in order to achieve effective mitigation measures because of the multiple jurisdictions here. Thinking of what comes next tonight after tonight, today was our second public meeting of the study. In the coming weeks, we're going to work on organizing input on the alternatives and analyses to finalize study recommendations and organize for what comes next. Looking ahead, MassDOT will continue to coordinate with local partners on next steps. At this point, we'd like to open up the floor to any members of the public in attendance who wish to speak or ask questions. We do welcome your questions, comments, feedback, etc. Do have some procedures to give you an idea of how we carry out this process. You can click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen to request to be unmuted for verbal questions. You can also use the keyboard shortcut Alt-Y on a computer. You can also use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type questions, comments, etc. In the interest of allowing everyone to speak today, we ask that you share one question or comment at a time and limit it to 2 minutes. If you have more to say, you're welcome to share additional comments and questions after others have had the opportunity to speak. If you're joining us by phone, you can dial *9 and I will call out the last 4 digits of your phone number and unmute your audio when it's time for you to speak. Finally, a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and all questions and comments are subject to disclosure for public records. By speaking or submitting anything in writing, you're consenting to be part of the record. We generally open up our public comment periods by allowing any elected officials or members of their staff in attendance to speak. So Gareth, if you would like to recognize any elected officials who might be here this evening.
Okay, thank you so much, Patrick. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gareth Saunders, and I'm representing MassDOT Legislative Affairs Office. So if we have any elected officials, whether local or state legislators, and if you have a question, or if we have some of your staff members in attendance, please use the raise your hand icon. We will acknowledge you, and you can ask your question. After the elected officials ask their questions, it'll be the meeting will be opened up to all the other attendees. Are there any elected officials that have questions they would like to ask tonight? Patrick, I guess we do not have any elected officials in attendance, so let's turn the meeting back over to our producers. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. If anyone is joining the call as an elected official, you're also welcome to put any questions or comments in the Q&A box at the bottom, or speak later in the meeting, or just hang out with us. For any members of the public in attendance, now's the time. If you'd like to share any questions or comments, you can raise the hand, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. In the event that you don't have any questions tonight, like I said, these slides will be posted online, and a recording of this meeting will be available, and you will be able to contact us later in the evening. But we'll give it a few moments. If anyone has any questions, comments, clarifying points they'd like, you can click the raise hand button, use the Q&A box, or like I said, you're welcome to send us an email later. Again, we do welcome questions and comments tonight, whether verbally, if you'd like to click the raise hand button, or click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, type it out. I'll give it another moment in case anyone's typing something longer. We'll also say that there are no silly questions, because often there are things that bear worth clarifying or following up on. We do thank everyone being here in attendance tonight, even if you don't have a question or comment and you're just here to listen in. In the meantime, if anyone is typing in the question and answer box or thinking about what they might want to ask or give comment on, if you want to write to us by mail, you can submit written comments to the Office of Transportation Planning, MassDOT, 10 Park Plaza, Suite 4150 in Boston. That's 02116 zip code. And if you could please just write "Attention Multimodal Planning" on the envelope, that'll make sure it gets to my group, and I will review it as the project manager for the study. You can also send in comments by email, planning@dot.state.ma.us. And we have a project website where you can sign up for updates, review these documents once they're posted. That's mass.gov/Martha's Vineyard Beach Road Study, with hyphens in between the words after the slash, and there's no comma thing in the Martha's word. Also have a QR code here, if that's easier. Unless anyone does have questions or comments, we will move toward closing out this meeting. Like I said, we do welcome questions or comments at a later date. We will be closing out tonight's meeting. I do thank all of you for being here, and I wish you a restful and relaxing evening.